Hi, and welcome to my MASC thesis project. My name is Helen Casera. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I am a religious educator, seminarian, and Unitarian Universalist minister in formation. This project is my big final project for my master's degree at Star King School for the Ministry, where I've been attending seminary for the last 3 years. This project is the culmination of about 10 years of education in psychology, social work, human development, religion, spirituality, and religious leadership for social change, as well as my personal experiences working with children for over 15 years, serving a congregation with trauma through trauma, and navigating my own spiritual and healing journey. I am a living testament to the transformative power of beloved community. I grew up in a family system that was plagued by trauma, and I was loved into being by my beloved community, Westside Unitarian Universalist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. If not for Westside, and specifically for Reverend Carol, who I am lucky to call my mentor as well as my best friend's mom, I would have been consumed by the pain and trauma of distance from love and distance from beloved community. Reverend Carol was the first person who ever told me just 4 years ago, you are loved and you are worthy of love. And that is the message I've been determined to carry into the world with my ministry ever since. We all exist in a world and in systems that are plagued by trauma, whether we realize it or not. The purpose of this project is to unpack all of that a little bit by offering a starting point and intentional space to explore where trauma shows up in our lives and in our societies. This presentation is a reflection of my written project, which is a 5-workshop adult education curriculum that includes resources, centering activities, and a ritual container for this courageous exploration. I've been very influenced by the work of Brené Brown and her research around shame and vulnerability, which helped me decide to structure this program this way. I began this as a traditional thesis paper, but I found that writing it that way lacked some elements that would make it accessible to those who need it the most. There's definitely a place for traditional academic papers, but this just wasn't it. This subject matter is messy, it is vulnerable, human stuff, and it needs to be presented pastorally. It needs to be presented with reverence for the massive vulnerability it takes to show up with a student mentality for topics that are so inherently personal. So I want to thank you for your showing upness, your willingness to let me share my work with you, and your trust that I will do so with the utmost reverence for our shared humanity. As a Unitarian Universalist religious educator and minister in formation, I covenant with you to be gentle, to hold space for your questions and struggles, and to remember that this is my life's work, but it might be the first time you've ever engaged with some of these topics. A covenant to center the inherent worth, dignity, and divinity of every being, even those whose actions and perspectives I condemn and find harmful. I hope you will covenant with me to receive this information with an open heart and mind, to notice where resistance or distress may arise, and to care for yourself however you need to in those moments. I invite you to disagree with me, to engage with curiosity, to try things on, even if there's no way you think they might fit. This is an offering. It is not a mandate that you conform to my perspective. It's an opportunity to consider some pretty big ideas in a way that may be new or uncomfortable. That can be challenging and even daunting, and that's okay. I invite you to welcome whatever arises with non-judgment and curiosity, trusting that each and every emotion and thought have something important to communicate. I'm going to light a chalice to begin our time together, using the chalice lighting words I wrote for our workshop. So, oh goodness, having trouble with the fire. With gratitude for our gathering. Oh, come on. Need a new match. With gratitude for our gathering, we light this chalice as a symbol of enduring hope as we navigate journeys of joy and of sorrow. May our time together be blessed with curiosity, holy aha moments, and sacred stumbling. May we greet our growing edges with grace, learning to embrace them as beloved teachers. And may we allow ourselves to be awestruck by wonder for our beloved community and all that is our lives. Blessed be. Set that right there while we chat, and we'll extinguish it at the end. This is our ritual container today. So what is my why? My why is my beloved community, my beloved son, Henry, who inspired me to go back to school and finish my associates and now my master's. When he was just 6 months old, we started that journey together. And in the center there, my beloved community at Westside UU in Knoxville. That was the first Pride after I came out, and my whole congregation, it felt like the whole congregation marched together. And there are some beloved queer elders in that photo who have since left this life, and they inspire me every single day. And so do the brilliant kids that I have the honor of serving at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tallahassee. This is a photo from our most recent bridging service that we did to honor one of our graduating seniors. And this work is my heart and my call and my passion. And when I am tempted to give up and be hopeless, it's almost always the kids and the teens who bring me back. So there's our chalice lighting. So this whole project is about trauma. And when I think of trauma, I think of things that put distance between us, between each other, between us in a sense of safety. I suggest that all actions and experiences exist on a spectrum ranging from love to distance from love. We can ask ourselves, is this action, is this choice closer to love or closer to distance from love? And distance from love, if we want to, we can consider it interchangeably with distance from community, distance from acceptance, safety, God, or the beloved community. I couldn't summarize the beloved community better than the King Center could. So I'm just going to read what they had to say with gratitude for their words. Dr. King's beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood of kinship. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. Dr. King's beloved community was not devoid of interpersonal, group, or international conflict. Instead, he recognized that conflict was an inevitable part of human experience, but he believed that conflicts could be resolved peacefully and adversaries could be reconciled through a mutual, determined commitment to nonviolence. No conflict, he believed, need erupt in violence. All conflicts in the beloved community should end with reconciliation of adversaries cooperating together in a spirit of friendship and goodwill. And I know that might sound a little wishful thinking. It might sound like a pipe dream. It might sound just absolutely just unimaginable to some folks. And I'd like to suggest that an iPhone was absolutely unimaginable to somebody who lived even 100 years ago. And the world that we live in now had to be imagined and the world that our children are going to inherit from us has to be imagined. And if we do not put intention into imagining and creating it, they'll get the same that we got, which is leads us right next to the next point. What is trauma? So trauma is a response. It is a response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event or experience that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of hopelessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. This is a list of types of traumatic experiences. It is absolutely not exhaustive. Physical trauma, the idea of being physically wounded, abused, or harmed, emotional trauma, including manipulation, invalidation, verbal emotional abuse, emotional neglect, gaslighting, etc. Religious or spiritual trauma is something we hear a lot about here in the South, especially harm perpetuated by a religious body or in the name of religion or spirituality, and harm to one's relationship with spirituality or religion, harm to one's relationship or sense of connection to source or a God figure. Sexual trauma, including sexual harassment, assault, rape, coercion, financial trauma, the trauma of being in chronic poverty, the trauma of having financial barriers to having your basic needs met. Environmental trauma might include the trauma of living without access to clean water or with the physical impacts of climate change and pollution, and might also include the trauma of living through a natural disaster like a hurricane or tornado. Racial and ethnic trauma is the trauma of living in white supremacy culture and racism that is inflicted upon Black and brown bodies. The trauma of compulsory assimilation and distance from one's ethnic heritage and culture as well. Identity-based traumas might be trauma of experienced discrimination based on one's identities, sexual orientation, stuff like that. Cultural, societal trauma, just the trauma of existing in a world that doesn't want us to exist, where we are all inherently oppressed, and we're going to talk more about that later. And all kinds of life-changing events can be traumatic, even things such as war, pandemics, birth, death of a loved one, loss of a beloved structure or routine. When it overwhelms our ability to cope, even if it's a good thing, birth is a profoundly traumatic experience for a lot of people who give birth because it overwhelms their ability to cope. It is so intense that it overwhelms their ability to cope and becomes a trauma. So trauma, it's not just the traumatic event itself, it's how our minds and bodies process it or don't. And if these traumas are not processed, they live in our bodies, and our bodies remember even if we don't. It's important to remember that there is no hierarchy of trauma. What I mean by that is that no matter what, someone's experience of trauma is valid. And the impact of it is real and important. And there may be varying levels of severity. Some things may be more serious than others or impact someone more or less than others, but it's all valid. You don't have to suffer more than someone else for your suffering to be valid. All suffering is valid. So all of these ideas of trauma include a thread of disconnection from self, from others, from safety, from resources, or from source. And that disconnection is a really important piece. Human beings are wired for connections. It is part of our instincts. Human babies are born entirely dependent on our caregivers. We're actually biologically born pretty premature compared to a lot of the rest of the animal kingdom. And so we can depend entirely on our caregivers. Human babies are entirely helpless. And so we know from birth on an instinctive level that we need each other so much that being disconnected from one another means certain death. And that doesn't go away when we're older, when we're able to care for ourselves more. That need for connection is still very much there. So someone who has experienced harm or trauma will naturally attempt to protect themselves from being harmed again. And often this happens without even realizing it. And of course we do. This is how we survive. As I have taught my son, every creature has a defense mechanism. Some animals have super speed or strength or sharp teeth or claws that can keep them safe from danger and that they can use to protect themselves. Human beings have some stuff like that too, and one of them is trauma response. So what is trauma response? Trauma response is the reflexive use of over-adaptive coping mechanisms in the real or perceived presence of a traumatic event. That's something really important to note, that the threat doesn't go through a filter of, is this logical, is this real? If the threat is perceived, our bodies and nervous systems will react. That's the automatic part, right? It doesn't matter if it's, if it's a stressful email, if it's road rage, or if you're being chased by a wild animal, that process of activation and response is still very much the same. So there are 4 types of trauma responses. Once upon a time, you would have just thought fight or flight. And semi-recently, the idea of freeze was added in there, and even more recently, the idea of fawn, and we're going to talk about all of them. So that first type of trauma response is fight. Okay, there is a threat, and I'm going to fight it off. The second type of trauma response is flight. Okay, there's a threat, and I'm going to get myself very far away from it. The third type is freeze. This is a deer in the headlights situation. This is, I'm not sure what exactly to do, but I'm going to be very still and maybe they can't see me. Maybe the threat will be neutralized if I just freeze. And the last one is fawn. This is what you might associate with the idea of Stockholm Syndrome. This is people-pleasing behaviors that are done to minimize the impact of trauma or minimize or neutralize the threat. If you think about someone experiencing emotional abuse and walking on eggshells around their abuser, that's a fawn response, trying to appease the abuser so that they will not continue to abuse them, or so that the harm will be reduced. So we have 4 types of trauma responses. And here's this trauma response cycle that I was talking about. So in unprocessed trauma that just exists, hasn't been intentionally processed or integrated, we have a trigger or a setting event. Lots of commentary about triggers and being triggered, right? A trigger is just whatever sets off a reaction. It can be fireworks for someone who's maybe experienced gun violence. The sound of fireworks might be a trigger for someone who is experiencing grief. A certain smell, if you've lost your grandmother and you're walking through somewhere and smell her perfume, maybe that someone else is wearing, that can be a trigger as well. All of any sensory input that reminds the body of the trauma can be a trigger. So there's a trigger or a setting event, and the automatic reaction is the nervous system identifies the threat and it reacts. It responds with fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And very often, especially when we're not putting intention into disrupting these reactions, all of that happens just like that. And you wouldn't even think that there's multiple steps happening because it's instantaneous, right? And trauma response is not a bad thing. Trauma responses are actually a very good thing. They are our nervous system's way of trying to keep us safe. And that's the most natural instinct in the world. We are, at our cores, animals, right? We are animals who are here to survive and procreate. And that is what our body is trying to do here. But if we're not mindful, if we don't know that trauma can affect us, if we're not mindful of it, sometimes those automatic reactions, those automatic things that we do to try to protect ourselves from a threat, real or perceived, aren't effective for the situation. Sometimes we need to put effort into dismantling that automatic response because it's not helping us in our relationships. It doesn't serve the purpose it originally did anymore. In situations of distress, overwhelm, confusion, or trauma, cognitive dissonance is where a lot of us get stuck. So cognitive dissonance is when you have conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. It's very hard to hold 2 things at the same time that are in conflict with each other. The example that's given here is the dissonance happens when you smoke cigarettes, which I did in my early 20s, I know what this is like. But you also have the belief like cigarettes are not healthy, but I'm still smoking cigarettes. And that tension, that dissonance is the discomfort, the kind of guilt, oh, I really shouldn't be doing this, that feeling when you buy another pack, but you really know you shouldn't. That's cognitive dissonance. And to resolve cognitive dissonance, humans don't like being uncomfortable, right? We are comfort creatures. We want to be comfortable. That makes us feel safe, right? So discomfort feels unsafe in our bodies. So to resolve that, we will either change our action or change our belief. So to change our action, we're gonna go with, okay, smoking cigarettes is unhealthy, so I'm not going to smoke cigarettes anymore. Or if we're not going to do that, we're going to change our belief. We're going to say, oh, you know what? Maybe it's not conclusive. Maybe I don't smoke enough for it to be an issue. I am going to change my belief about smoking cigarettes so that I can continue to do it without feeling this discomfort and this yuck in the pit of my tummy. That is a very simplified example. But I think it is a really good one. It's something that a lot of us might be able to resonate with. So when we're facing cognitive dissonance, we're either going to change our behavior or our belief. And very much like a trauma response, this is part of our mind trying to keep us safe and make sense of the situation. Because if we can't make sense of something, it overwhelms us and we don't know how to deal with it. So some examples of this, while we will either quit smoking cigarettes or decide that they're not that bad. We will either find a way to leave an abusive situation, or we will continue to justify it or make excuses as to why we haven't left yet. And that is definitely not to minimize the massive undertaking that it is to leave an abusive situation. I want to be very clear, like, I get it. We will either acknowledge our role in harm or we're going to blame others for that harm happening. We're either going to admit that we lost the election or we are going to insist that it was stolen from us. We're either going to deal with our own trauma. We're going to deal with our own discomfort, whatever is happening. We're going to deal with it courageously and honestly, or we're going to project it onto others. And these are, some of these are examples of things that aren't necessarily healthy for us, not great for our relationships, but they are our minds trying to keep us safe, our bodies trying to keep us safe and comfortable. And that's okay. Like I said before, our minds and bodies don't necessarily know that we are living very different lives from our ancestors. Our nervous systems will respond to a real or perceived threat. So it doesn't matter if it's a woolly mammoth or a critical email from our response. And sometimes, especially after experiencing trauma, our instinctive reaction is out of proportion or overadaptive to the stimulus. That just means that it doesn't serve the purpose of keeping us safe anymore. And the reaction is causing more trouble than it is helping. And so when we're in these experiences of trauma and trauma response, and which let me be clear, this is just going through life. When we are going through life, if we do not have the emotional intelligence and the skills required to identify when we're responding from a place of trauma, we're going to stay in that cycle of trauma and trigger and trauma responses. It takes intention to disrupt it, and that can be hard. Okay, cool. It's a lot of information. What can we do with it? We're going to start by talking about a person and environment perspective. And what this does is we consider a person in their entire environment, their holistic biopsychosocial and spiritual experience. And so that means the context of their environment, relationships, and their past experiences. This allows us to consider all of a person's intersecting needs and ideas, because no one is one side, right? All of us are multifaceted, extremely complex individuals. And when we are trying to understand our experiences and our collective experiences, we can't just look at one thing. So in social work, we use the biopsychosocial spiritual. It's kind of exactly what it sounds like. So the bio piece refers to one's physical health and well-being. Psycho, their emotional, their feelings, their emotions, how they manage them or don't. Their social, their relationships, their how they are connected with other people, and they're spiritual. This doesn't have to mean someone's religion. And if they're not religious, this isn't exclusive of non-religious people. Spiritual just means their sense of how they relate to philosophical questions, because no matter what your religion or lack of one is, we all have those big questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens to us when we die? Things like that. And how we orient to those questions is an important part of how we orient to the world. And all of this information together allows us to consider a person's intersecting identities and needs. Intersectionality is a really important piece here. It's a term coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw that refers to the unique experience of people with coexisting identity issues. Specifically created this term to speak to the experience of Black women living at the intersection of being Black and being a woman, and how that experience of being a Black woman is unique in ways that can't be fully defined by either group. So a Black woman's experience and perspectives will be different from a white woman's perspectives, and from a Black man's perspectives, it will all be very different, right? And understanding a person's holistic experience, their intersecting identities, can help us understand more of where they're coming from and what they're bringing to the table, what motivates them, what impacts them. It's an important practice in humanization, because we are so tempted, especially these days, to dehumanize each other and to reduce each other to one-word labels and one-label identities, when we are all multitudes, right? We're all multitudes. We all have an incredible amount of complexity, and that can be overwhelming to think about. But when we are conditioned to think of each other as our fellow travelers, as us or them, and reduce each other to labels and just pieces of our identities, we lose the opportunity to revel in the vast miracle that is all of us. So two very important quotes here from the author of My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. His name is Resmaa Menakem. First, he says, as any therapist will tell you, healing involves discomfort, but so does refusing to heal. And over time, refusing to heal is more painful. Clean pain hurts like hell, but it enables our bodies to grow through our difficulties, develop nuanced skills, and mend our trauma. Dirty pain is the pain of avoidance, blame, and denial. When people respond from their most wounded parts, become cruel or violent, or physically or emotionally run away, they experience dirty pain, and they also create more of it for others. This is what we see in generational trauma, when there is a grandparent who has experienced trauma that impacts them and the way they show up in the world. If they drink it away, their child is going to be handed the trauma and charged with unpacking the trauma of growing up with an alcoholic parent. And if that, and that their child has the opportunity to heal it or pass it on to their child. And when we pass on that pain, when we avoid it, pretend it's not real, pretend, oh, that's just the way the family's always been, it's fine, we're robbing ourselves of an opportunity to live into our wholeness. And that brings me to this next quote. Many times trauma in a person, decontextualized over time, can look like personality. Trauma in a family, decontextualized over time, can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people over time can look like a culture, and it takes time to slow down so you can begin to discern what's what. So decontextualized trauma and dirty pain left resolved over time looks like systems of oppression. It looks like generational trauma, and it looks like, well, that's just the way it's always been, and a hopelessness around improvement. So this is going to feel like a hard pivot, but I promise it will make sense soon. So what is Christian nationalism, and why is it an example of trauma decontextualized over time? We're going to talk about Christian nationalism in general a little bit, and then we are going to talk about the January 6th insurrection. And the reason that we're using this as a population sample size of Christian nationalists is based primarily in these two really important reports, one from the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty on the insurrection and the influences of white Christian nationalism in that movement, and also this report on the University of Chicago project, or from the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Both of these reports are part of the workshop material. They're I don't want to say impossible to summarize, very difficult to summarize. So there's my receipts. All the information is there. I'm going to do my best to contextualize this as we go. But basically, the January 6th insurrection was heavily influenced by white Christian nationalism, and the ideas and the ideology and of the participants really reflect Christian nationalist views. So we're using them as a sample size to talk about this population. Yeah, it'll make sense, I promise. So the BJC has this fantastic definition of Christian nationalism that says, Christian nationalism is a political ideology and cultural framework that seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism relies on the mythological founding of the U.S. as a Christian nation, singled out for God's providence in order to fulfill God's purposes on earth. Christian nationalism demands a privileged place for Christianity in public life, buttressed by the active support of government on all levels. It's okay if that's a little thick and you're like, I don't get it yet. That's okay. We're going to break it down a little bit further. And when we're talking about Christian nationalism, we're not talking about Christianity. We're talking about this specific political ideology that says, you know what, the US should be a Christian nation. And really, it always has been. And we should have laws based on Christianity. We should have laws based on clobber texts, which is a phrase that means, cherry-picked verses from scripture, and that this should be okay because it always should have been a Christian nation. The US is very, very clearly not a Christian nation. The Establishment Clause, of course, says that the government's not going to establish a religion, endorse a religion, and then the First Amendment gives all of us the right to freely practice our religion. And I like that they use the word myth. The mythological founding of the US as a Christian nation, because a myth implies that it's widespread and it's kind of an urban legend. It's something that a lot of people have heard, and some just take at face value, have never had corrected. Some know that that's not that. Some just, if you hear your pastor say that, you're not going to question it. And that's the thing that's the thing we're going to get into. So an important consideration, we're looking right here at faith representation in Congress. This was in 2021. So in 2021, Christians represented 88.1% of Congress. Other faiths represented about 7.2%, and the unaffiliated, the unchurched, just 0.2%. But if you look at the general population, Christians only represent 65%. Other faiths, Unitarian Universalism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, all the other ones represent just 6%. But the second largest group of people in the US after Christians are folks who are completely religiously unaffiliated, folks who are atheist, agnostic, haven't even thought about it, the religious nuns, as we call them. So as we can see here, there is a dramatic disproportional representation of Christians in Congress, and that makes it a lot easier for it to look like Well, that makes it a lot easier for laws that are based in Christianity or based in very specific versions of Christianity to be passed, and they kind of have a supermajority. There's not often much else that can happen. Now, of course, if you're looking at, 88.1% of Congress is Christian. I'm not remotely suggesting that all of them are Christian nationalists, but some of them are. Marjorie Taylor Greene is a Christian nationalist, and she's a scary person to have in a political power because she has no idea what she is doing. And she is not there to serve anyone except herself and people like her. And it is very scary when we have very obviously racist, sexist, homophobic, Christian supremacist people in government making laws, right? And all of this data comes from the Pew Research Center. So in the workshops, we take a whole workshop to unpack what is Christian nationalism and what are these frequently asked questions and common misconceptions. We're going to go through them very quickly here, though. Why am I hating on Christians? I am not hating on Christians. I could there's probably a good argument to say that I'm a Christian myself. I do have a personal relationship with Jesus of Nazareth, but I don't consider him my savior. I consider him my teacher and my classmate and another person fighting the good fight against the man. But I am being very critical of versions of Christianity that don't center Jesus and don't center loving our neighbors, but are part of a religion of empire and are part of power grabs. Aren't Christians oppressed and persecuted? Kind of. In some parts of the world now, absolutely yes. Not in the United States. And historically, absolutely, Christians were martyred, were definitely persecuted. But the thing is, somewhere along the way, Christianity became part of the dominant culture, became a dominant religion, became a religion that dominated and was a tool of of domination, of power, and a religion of empire. And at that point, you can't really argue that they're being persecuted if they are the top dogs, for lack of a better descriptor there. Aren't straight white Christians becoming a minority? This is a common talking point that, people like me want everybody to be, gay atheists, and eliminate white people hating on white people. I think what that question is actually asking, though, or suggesting, is that straight white Christians are very afraid that if they become a minority, they will be treated the way that they currently treat minorities. Well, Christian nationalists aren't even real Christians. They're not real Christians. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. This statement actually, it accomplishes two things, and neither one of them are helpful. First, it lets Christians off the hook. It says, oh, they're not with us. They don't count. They're not ours. Like, we don't have to deal with them. We're not responsible for holding them accountable. They're making the whole faith look bad. So we're just going to say no. And it distracts from the fact that no matter what you call them, they're causing harm. And the harm is so much more important than what you call the people causing the harm. And a really important thing to consider is that none of us have the right to try and police somebody else's faith. If somebody else tells me they're a Christian, I'm going to believe them. It's not my business. I am not the Christianity police. It's not my place or my business to question someone's faith or the validity of their faith. If someone tells me they are whatever religion, I am going to believe them and I'm going to accept that. And I'm going to say, okay, cool. What does that mean for you? But it's not necessarily our place to question what someone's faith is or isn't. So next we have But isn't the United States a Christian nation? No, it was founded by some people who were Christian, but was expressly founded as a country based on the idea of religious freedom and um, the religions. I took a whole class on religious freedom, justice, and democracy, and it was absolutely eye-opening. And there's no way to really succinctly explain how these narratives of religious freedom and religious persecution have really permeated the mainstream, and how this myth of the US being a Christian nation is so widely distributed. But no, constitutionally, legally, the US is not a Christian nation. But not all Christians are like this. Of course they aren't. It really sucks to be lumped in with the worst of your worst peers who are making y'all look bad, doesn't it? Nobody really likes stereotypes. Stereotypes don't serve any purpose but to cause harm and dehumanize. Not, of course, not all Christians are like this, but enough of them are, that harm is occurring, and when harm is occurring, we have a duty to disrupt it. Why are you bringing race into it? Because race is a part of it. Because these early arguments about religious freedom and Christian supremacy are intimately linked to white supremacy and racism. And, you know, the reality of the history of race in the United States is not taught widely. It is not valued. It is something that we like to sweep under the rug. It is something that we like to pretend isn't there. And because of that, we have so much dirty pain around race and racism in this country because we want to pretend it doesn't exist, but it exists. It is real. It is heavy. And it makes people who look like me very uncomfortable. And that is simultaneously understandable and no longer acceptable. It is okay to be uncomfortable. It is not okay to deny the lived experiences of our fellow human beings because we are uncomfortable. It takes a ton of courage to commit to learning how to do better and commit to learning the real and true history of our country. It gutted me to look at the pictures of Emmett Till's face after he was murdered. And it gutted me to watch the video of George Floyd being murdered. But that is what we owe to our fellow travelers, to be gutted, to feel it as deeply as if it is our children, because it is our children. It is God's children. We are all God's children. And some of God's children are hurting because of what people who look like me have done and perpetuated. And we have a responsibility to set it right. It can be like climate change. We are allowed to know that we didn't make the whole mess. None of my ancestors owned slaves, to my knowledge. Actually, none of my ancestors thought it was okay to own people or to enslave people, to my knowledge. But that doesn't mean I don't have white privilege. I don't get an opt out because my ancestors came over on the boat 100 years ago. I have benefited from the exploitation of Black and brown bodies, and it is my duty as a human being to just do better when I know better and to educate myself so that I can harm other people as little as possible. And that's all it is. It's harm reduction and it's repair for harm that has happened. And there's my soapbox. Reverse racism. Okay, reverse racism doesn't exist. Racism is different from individual acts of discrimination. Anyone can discriminate against somebody based on their skin color, based on their hair color, based on their abilities, their attitude, whatever. It is absolutely possible for a Black person to discriminate against a white person, just like it's absolutely possible for a straight person to discriminate against a gay person, or a gay person to discriminate against a straight person. That's entirely possible and happens. Nobody's denying that happens, but racism is a system of oppression. Racism is the result of hundreds of years of one race having total power over another. And it requires the social capital, we say, which just means the power. It requires the power to oppress another person. And at the end of the day, a Black person does not have the social power to oppress a white person. Therefore, reverse racism doesn't really exist. Individual acts of discrimination can exist, absolutely, but racism is a system of oppression, and Black people don't have the systemic power to oppress white people, therefore cannot be racist towards white people. Why does it matter? Oh, that's such a good question. Because Jesus. Because love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. When we love our neighbors, we care if they are hurt or hurting. We care if they have enough to eat. We care if they feel seen. We care if their schools are safe. I read somewhere that the United States does a really good job of crisis empathy. We are so good in a crisis, but we are terrible at sustained chronic compassion. We lack compassion for our fellow human beings, and it is the core of everything. And that's trauma. It's a trauma response to not be able to see your fellow human beings as human. All right, so that was a lot. Just pause. Take a deep breath. And notice how you're feeling. What's coming up for you? Are you angry? Are you overwhelmed? Are you interested? Are you confused? It's okay. Whatever you are feeling is okay. You don't have to do anything with that feeling except notice it. Just notice it. Name it if you can. So next we're gonna try out putting on a trauma-informed perspective, and we're gonna try out thinking about what might be going on in the minds of these folks who are perpetuating these Christian nationalist ideas and ideologies. So, like I said before, we're going to focus on this population, this sample of Christian nationalists or folks who were involved in the January 6th insurrection in 2021. So there were 716 participants, and what this report out of the Chicago's found, it was so interesting, was that these aren't necessarily radicals. These aren't necessarily folks on the fringe. These aren't people who are these are folks at your kid's soccer game, and local business owners. Significant number of them were business owners. They were typically regular citizens who took a couple of days off of their day job to go storm the Capitol. Again, I highly recommend those reports by the BJC and the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. So what I did here is I took some stats from our insurrectionists and compared them to some stats from the general population. So you can see that the general population is 45.5% male, and 85% of our insurrectionists were male. 93% were white, 49 were age 35 to 54, so average adult male, and 25% were college educated. So we pop those together. We say our average January 6th insurrectionist was a white male, age 35 to 54, without a college degree. And why does this matter? Because a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It's not just the folks who stormed the Capitol, it's the people who agree with their message, the ones who've been intentionally misinformed by fear-mongering and lies, the people who have been told for years that they're being persecuted, that there is a war on Christmas, attacks on family values, and other really intentional and really well-crafted misrepresentations of truth. These are a lot of folks who have been told that their faith is being threatened, that they are, that their status as their dominant status is being threatened, and that their existence is being threatened for being white and male, which is not true, but that's established. These folks have been told that their faith is being threatened, and often at the exact same time, they've been systemically conditioned by their faith communities to not ask questions. If you're asking questions of your faith community, of your religious leaders, you are asking questions of God, and are you questioning the word of God? And it is very manipulative, and it is a proven effective way to hold power over someone, because you're not just threatening them in this moment, you are threatening them for all of eternity. If they ask a question, they are risking their eternal salvation, their eternal soul, and those stakes are so high. And that's intentional. That it's to isolate people and to really maintain the in-group and out-group, that in-group of folks in the church who are truth, who are whatever else, who can be trusted, and how nobody else can. This is the reason that evangelical churches send their people door to door to spread the good word. They know that nobody wants to come to their door. Nobody wants somebody to come to their door to try to convince them to change their religion. But it serves a very particular purpose, because when you go out door to door all day, getting doors slammed in your face, even the people who are polite probably aren't as many. But when you get doors slammed in your face all day and you go back to your community and they embrace you, and they say, oh, you did the good work, you're doing so good, we love you so much, like, and you have that shared experience, it strengthens your bond to your community, and it strengthens the idea that everyone else is other, and that their community is a safe place. And you can't question it. You don't even think to question it. And if you do, you know better, because you don't question the church, you don't question God. And because God is punitive and vengeful and hateful effectively. And this is also part of why former President Trump had such an incredible appeal to this population. He embodies that really punitive, vengeful leader that so many people have been taught to associate with God. So Christian nationalism as a trauma response. How on earth could Christian nationalism be a trauma response? What? You're just a liberal snowflake with purple hair. This is silly. I hear you. It's a good question. And let's do a quick review, and then I think it'll make some sense once I get into it. So trauma is a stimulus that overwhelms one's ability to cope. Trauma response is an often over-adaptive automatic response to a real or perceived threat. Cognitive dissonance, that distress from holding opposing truths that causes someone to shift either their action or their belief. And we have 4 types of trauma response: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Christian nationalism is a political ideology that promotes Christian supremacy, and our demographics of Christian nationalists. The average January 6th insurrectionist was a white male aged 35 to 54 without a college degree. This does not, of course, represent the whole of Christian nationalism, but it is a pretty good sample size. And one more piece to add is toxic masculinity. This is the name for the expectation that men be unemotional, the expectation that men be strong and don't show emotion. And really the only acceptable one is anger. Anything other than anger is seen as weak or female-like. And if you're going to be feminine, it goes into so much internalized sexism, homophobia. We don't have time for all of that, but toxic masculinity is just a term that describes the way that men in our society are conditioned to be out of touch with their emotions, and it's effectively being emotionally stunted. It's not knowing how to communicate, not knowing how to express a feeling or think through a feeling logically or anything. It's anger. It's anger is acceptable and everything else is too girly. So it's a lack of healthy coping mechanisms for a normal range of human emotions. And there's this constant, well, it means that emotions are going to be overwhelming and cause feelings of hopelessness. And if, for example, the idea that cis white men are no longer going to be the majority, this idea of fueling like all of this fear, right? That's a trauma. The idea that like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to like change. I might be held accountable. What? So why do the demographics matter? The demographics tell us if this population is likely to have had opportunities to process ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. Part of the workshop materials is an ACE inventory, so folks know what that is. If this population has access to therapy, encouragement to feel or engage with their feelings, it gives insight to their rates of depression and suicide, their general satisfaction with life, level of education, socioeconomic status, etc. All of that synthesized through a biopsychosocial spiritual lens gives us data, and all of that data gives us insight to the psychological state and framework that they're coming from. It's not an exact science, but it doesn't have to be. It's to help gain insight, not make exact determinations. So here's some information that we have now based on our data. So our average 35 to 50-year-old white male without a college degree is 3.88 times more likely than a woman to attempt suicide, is significantly more likely to successfully complete suicide. Because of the methods that men are more likely to use than women. He is unlikely to seek mental health treatment. He is statistically more likely to commit a violent crime. He has likely experienced at least one traumatic event in his life. He is unlikely to have high emotional intelligence or resilience. 80%, 86% of men in general feel pressure to be emotionally strong, which typically means unemotional. And 57% of men in the US feel pressure, quote, to be willing to throw a punch if provoked. So 57% of men in the US feel pressure to be violent at the drop of a hat. It's a staggering just concept that exists in our society. So when we examine the data, we start to understand how toxic masculinity, white supremacy, culture, and cognitive dissonance overlap to create a society that systemically disempowers this population by emotionally stunting them, leaving them unable to handle the dissonance of their supremacy being questioned or perceived to be threatened, right? The idea is that if other people get a seat at the table, I won't get a seat at the table anymore. And that's not necessarily true, but it feels like that, right? So in the absence of healthy coping mechanisms and emotional intelligence, the sense of overwhelm and hopelessness surpasses their ability to cope. They can't deal with it. So they're experiencing trauma. And we begin to see that the average Christian nationalist in this demographic or this population has been emotionally under-resourced, socialized from birth to believe that his best option when threatened is to lash out. And when threatened with the cognitive dissonance of accepting and integrating their role in oppressive systems, they reject the possibility and anything else that threatens the system that simultaneously empowers and oppresses them, effectively making them guardians of the system, unable to escape it. It's a really important piece. Patriarchy and sexism hurts men too. It takes little boys who are emotionally no different than little girls and tells them they have no right to have feelings. And the only acceptable way to be a man is to use your fists instead of your words. And that he is entitled to whatever he wants. And when he doesn't get it, he can throw a temper tantrum and he should be able to get it. He can be violent, and that's the only way he knows how to do it. And that is oppression. Teaching men that they don't deserve to feel their feelings is oppressing them. And I'm not saying that men are the victims here. It is so much more complicated than that. But it is to say that this white man archetype, this emotionally under-resourced person, becomes an over-adaptive, self-protective feature of the system of oppression. And that's also known as a trauma response, this over-adaptive feature. These toxic men are an over-adaptive protective feature of the patriarchy or the kyriarchy. So remember, without developing the emotional intelligence and skills required to identify when we're responding from a place of trauma, we're going to remain in a cycle of triggers and trauma responses. I propose that Christian nationalism is a trauma response of the white patriarchy to the perceived threats to their social and political status and supremacy. Those who perpetuate Christian nationalism have been systemically disconnected from the beloved community and disempowered from resisting or critically engaging with their radicalization. And a trauma-informed approach can help address and dismantle this phenomenon. I'm not remotely saying it's easy, right? But it's possible. Christian nationalism is a fight response to being faced with acknowledging the ideas of power and privilege without the educational framework, emotional intelligence, or social support to maintain the regulation required to critically and meaningfully engage with those concepts. In the absence of that ability to understand, this challenge to do better, this social challenge, the pressure of women and people of color demanding rights and demanding to be seen and demanding our seats at the table, and so many other identities too. But in the absence of understanding that a seat for me doesn't mean you lose yours, the challenge is perceived as a threat. And I call this whole phenomenon, I call it Anagape trauma. I wanted a term that that encompasses the idea of the trauma from distance from the beloved community that leads one to lash out against it. So we have the agape is a Greek word, so we used a Greek prefix on, which means not, and then not agape love. Agape love is the love that builds and upholds the beloved community. It's the love of kinship. It's this sense of interconnectedness and love for all of humanity. And I think that that's as basic a need as anything else. Beloved community connection to others is as basic a need as any other need, and we experience trauma when we don't have it. There's a quote that says, the child who never feels the love of the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. It's very much like that. So please note, like most things, Christian nationalism is complicated. It's a complicated, multifaceted phenomenon. There's not a straightforward explanation or solution, but there are frameworks that can help us understand what it is and how it shows up in our society and where trauma might be at play. And that's the thing. Christian nationalism is one example. But you can apply this framework to most social issues. There is a ton of trauma in our society, and in order to heal, truly achieve liberty and justice for all, we must be willing to acknowledge and engage with that trauma that we have all experienced living in an inherently oppressive society. No matter who we are, what our identities are, or what our experiences have been, we are all human, and we have all been harmed by systems of oppression, even those of us who have privilege within those systems. Remember, as Audre Lorde said, I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. We have to choose to actively and intentionally disrupt cycles of trauma in ourselves, in our families, in our communities, and our society. Healing is hard. It hurts. It sucks. Like, it is not the most fun thing I have ever done, but it is so worth it. And I will take clean pain over dirty pain all day, every day. Being trauma informed, just being aware of what trauma is where it can be at play and how it shows up in our world can make all the difference in showing up wholeheartedly and effectively for this healing work together. Now pause. Oh my gosh, that was a lot. What's coming up for you? Where do you feel those feelings in your body? Just notice them. It's okay to just notice them. So without awareness, we have what we looked at before, right? Unprocessed trauma. We have a trigger and a setting event, an immediate nervous system identifying the threat, and then an instantaneous reactive trauma response. But what if we interrupt it? What if it looked more like this? We still have a trigger, a setting event, a nervous system reaction, and then a pause, just a pause. And then we intentionally disrupt whatever reaction comes next. We choose what comes next and instead of letting our nervous systems choose for us. That takes practice, but over time will yield a more productive, more effective response. When we're able to recognize that we are reacting from an unhealed part of ourselves, we can disrupt the entire cycle. Now pause. What if all it takes to change the world is a pause and a choice to do just a little bit better than we did last time? It's not on any of us to fix everything. We just have to do a little bit better. So over time, these cycles of trauma and trauma response and reaction will look more like this. It will look like more and more consistent and effective coping mechanisms emerging and actual progress happening when we are able to move ourselves out of that initial reaction. As Maya Angelou said, we do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. We are in a very interesting place of learning what's better now. And so many of our systems and routines and ideas are being challenged. And that is so scary. I imagine some of us think sometimes, wow, I wish things would just stay the same. And my prayer is that at some point as a society, we get to a place where things can stay the same because nobody's hurting from the way that they are. Unpacking and healing our trauma is a difficult and courageous act of worship, and it is an offering of love to ourselves and to our family of human kin. There's no good humans or bad humans. There's just humans who have experienced life with varying degrees of resilience, privilege, and struggle. We never have to condone or allow harm, but we should strive to remember that pain begets pain and hate begets hate. Most bullies were bullied themselves, either by people or by systems of disempowerment and oppression. At the end of the day, we're all just people trying to protect ourselves the best ways that we know how. And sometimes we do that in really ineffective ways. And that's okay. We're learning how to do better once we know better. Thank you so much for showing up for this conversation. I know it's a little long, and I know that some of it might not have fully resonated, and I know some of it may have been challenging for you. And I just appreciate your showing upness. I appreciate your presence and your sharing your time with me and with my research. And for our chalice extinguishing, I have a blessing for us from my book. It's called Something Resembling God. You cannot see it there. By me, H.P. Rivers. And this is a blessing that I wrote for my friend's installation. It's called This I Know. I have known everything, that Pluto is a planet, that the world is safe, that time is gentle and kind, that all is well. I have been wrong more than I have been right, but this I know is true. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, whatever you believe, somewhere there is a table with a seat saved especially for you. And there, hope is served. Great love of many names, I may not feel especially qualified to be the one heaping hope into hungry hearts, but here we are. And what I know is I have had enough hope pressed into my palm like a lucky stone to make me believe there's a reason to keep going, at least on most days. God, let me be a peddler of hope, a connoisseur of joy, sommelier of silver linings. And on the days I don't believe a goddamn word that I say, let me remember in my bones that it is my time to be served. Let me drink deeply from the rivers of hope that fill my cup. This I know. My cup will never go empty. My table mates will not allow it, and soon I will again fill theirs. This I know. We will never thirst when we are together, and hope has plenty of hiding spots, but she is always near. Beloved, may we always keep seeking, always keep striving, always remember we have a seat of honor at the table where hope is served. Blessed be. May we all have the courage to lean radically into beloved community. Thank you.